And here we are for another episode of Dualistic Unity Social. This one coming just before this week's roundtable. I am very excited for that because the roundtables are always insightful. They're always a great way to kind of touch base with the community, find out how everybody's journey is going, and then just marvel at how seamlessly it integrates with everybody else's journey who happens to be going through whatever it is they're going through, because there are undercurrents to all of this that we all have in common. It's just that we're not looking at it in the way that that we could. We're getting lost. We're looking at the forest, and or rather, we're losing the forest for the trees, is I guess the point. So it's really neat to be able to sit in these groups and listen to everybody and start to recognize a little bit more of that larger picture of how intelligence is kind of playing out between all of these quote unquote individual lives. I love the roundtables, I guess is what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, likewise. The roundtables, the groups, all of them, just people coming together and recognizing that they're not so alone in their experiences. Like it can be very isolating going through different degrees of suffering, basically, and going through things. Especially suffering psychologically inside of your head. You think that you're the only one going through it because it's all you know. You can't see what someone else is going through in their head, and I think it's super important to recognize that just how uncertain everything is all the time. Other people's perceptions, other people, what they're going through, like how quick we are to judge someone despite having not even the littlest degree of understanding of what they're really going through. And I think that's very, very important to keep in mind. And so the beauty of things like the roundtable, which we have coming up in a little under an hour, if anyone would like to join, this is a podcast episode that we do every 2 weeks where anyone on our Patreon, tier 2 or tier 3, can join an episode. And it's as many people who are able to join can hop in, and we just go around and chat and share things and share stories, experiences. If you have certain questions for us, you can ask them there. Maybe we'll throw you a question if you're feeling up for it. But they're a lot of fun. I think any of the times that we come together, it can be very, very beneficial. And I think even relative to something like therapy, I'm not saying, we've discussed many times therapy and therapists and have our perspectives on that. I'm not saying that a Patreon group's necessarily going to replace your therapy sessions or whatever you're going through. But sometimes even something like therapy can be very isolating because you're going to it alone, trying to figure out your own stuff, making the assumption that you have things to figure out. Whereas with a group, you can see that other people are going through very similar experiences. Other people are going through very similar things that you are. Maybe not the exact same experience on the surface, but where it's coming from, the same insecurities, the same fears, the same concerns. And the more you can recognize that you're not the only one going through it, the lighter it gets. Doesn't solve it by any means, but at least there's a degree of lightness that comes along with recognizing that you're not alone in the experience that you're going through.
Well said. Absolutely. I think that's exactly it. Now, we've said this a number of times. Like, there is always going to be the experience of feeling like you're alone because you are the only one living your life. You're the only one that's ultimately responsible for what it is you're going through. You're the only one that's in the driver's seat. You're the only one that is you. So no matter how much you might attach to other people, when you go to bed at night, you're the one that's left with yourself. And that can feel like a lot until you start to recognize that everybody else is going through that. And so while nobody can relate to you and your experience, everyone can relate to what it is to have no one that can relate to their experience. We're all going through the uncertainty together. We're all going through this same puzzle of responsibility and accountability without necessarily fault and guilt and judgment. So that way we can make everything into a lesson, everything into a chance to grow, everything into an opportunity to experience more of what we are rather than more of what we fear we are. It's a hell of a process. I want to say hi to everybody because we have some people that are currently watching us on Instagram and on Twitch and YouTube and so on and so forth. As Andrew mentioned, we are having a roundtable episode today, which is available for tier 2 or tier 3 supporters on Patreon. We've had a bunch of new supporters this month. A quick shout out to them. It means a lot to us, and it's great to be able to see all of you in the groups, even if it's not a roundtable, because not everybody has to participate in a roundtable, though you're welcome to. The fact is that having people with the courage to just enter the conversation. That's really all it is. It's not trying to get to a certain place, although that's often what we think when we first get into this conversation. We think that we're trying to get somewhere where there is a cessation of the pain and a cessation of the doubt and a cessation of the suffering, that none of that's going to exist once I achieve enlightenment. And then slowly you start to realize that the real enlightenment is the ending of that illusion, and the recognition that you are here and you are a lot, and that doesn't have to frighten you. You can allow it to unfold. You can let go. You can have faith in yourself, and everything will eventually start to become more and more clear, just by virtue of the fact that you are intelligence expressed. And you don't have to believe in God or the universal consciousness or any of that crap. And I mean that. You don't need to think about any of that crap. But if you look at the fact that, again, DNA itself at its most basic level has evidence of awareness. It's aware of itself. It's aware of its environment. It's aware that it should adapt to its environment. And we are a collection of DNA working in greater and greater levels of complexity. Our organs work in different ways. Our brain works in different ways. Our nervous system works in different ways. And yet it all works together as an expression of intelligence. It's not the kind of intelligence that writes books. It's the kind of intelligence that makes it fucking possible for you to write a book, which is more than we can grasp, because we tend to think that concepts indicate intelligence rather than intelligence being able to play with concepts. Right? But it really is that. You are intelligence expressed. Infinite, universal intelligence expressed in all living things in whatever form and capacity that they can. And the only thing you're trying to do is get more intelligent rather than get out of the way of the intelligence that you already are.
Yeah, and in that recognition is the recognition that all of the things that you think are inherently wrong with you, or incorrect, that you're trying to fix or solve or make up for in other ways, are just a component of that illusion, are just a component of that idea that you exist as something separate from the universe. When you recognize that you're it, you are reality, you are life, you are the universe expressing itself. All of those conceptual ideas of what you have to fix and solve and overcome in your life aren't things. Like, the thing that you're going through, even if you get diagnosed with some sort of disorder, say you get diagnosed with ADHD, that's just a label for how you experience reality. Like, it doesn't mean that there's inherently something wrong with you, and it's not something to solve. It's just a label on top of what you are, because we have this idea of normal. We have this idea of what fits, quote unquote, correctly into our society. And if you have ADHD, it's outside of that normalcy. But it doesn't mean it's wrong, because there is no normal. Normal is something that's been constructed by our society in order to make us, certain people, feel more comfortable. Usually it was the people who had more control, had more authority, had more power, that create this idea of normal as a reflection of themselves so that they can feel a little bit more comfortable. I'm this way. I got to make up this whole idea of what it means to be normal. Someone who just follows the rules, does these things, and is easy to manipulate, essentially, and can just study things, go through school very well, understand concepts, then get into the workforce and do all these things. And anyone who doesn't fit that mold is considered abnormal. They're perceived to have something wrong with them, or there's a societal ideal of the way to look or the way to sound or the way to act or the way to express yourself. And if you're outside of those bounds, you think there's something wrong with you. And there isn't. Like, that's the fundamental recognition, is that there isn't. All the things that you think there are wrong with you aren't. And just recognizing that doesn't solve all of your issues, but it does shift your experience just a bit. Because if you were to take, say, everyone listening after the fact in the recording, think of 3 things that you perceive to be wrong with yourself. What if you recognize that they weren't? What if you recognize that there actually wasn't anything wrong with any of those things? All of a sudden you can, like, drop your shoulders a little bit. You're a little bit less stressed, a little bit less concerned about trying to figure out a way to not look like that, sound like that, act like that, be like that. And then you start seeing things a little bit differently. And there isn't so much overlaid stress or concern about fixing yourself. Because as we think there's something wrong with us, our focus, our priority becomes fixing that or making up for that. We're insecure about a certain thing. Society tells us, oh, just make a bunch of money. People will like you. People will love you. You'll get people to interact with you more. You know, you do there's all sorts of things that society tells us is a way to make up for the thing. If you can't solve the thing inherently, say it's how you look, just do something else. And even now we can, we have fixes for that with plastic surgery, but it's this underlying fundamental misunderstanding about what you are, that you're not something inherently tied to the fabric of reality, that you're not the fabric of reality itself. It's not even a component of it or tied to it. You're it. You are reality expressing itself. And so, how could there be anything wrong with that? And the things that we think are wrong are just ideas that we maintain inside of our head because as a society, we've come up with this idea of normal and the right way to act, the right way to be, the right way to think. If you don't think these ways, then you're abnormal. Even, church and fucking religion has done a great job of this, that, even thinking a lustful thought, they say you picture someone naked, that's a mortal sin right there. You do that, you're going to hell. It's a thought. So they think that you actually have control of your thoughts that's a fundamental misunderstanding about thought, as if thought is something that we do as opposed to something that we become aware of. We become aware of thoughts. There's something that we can either focus a lot of attention on or not focus a lot of attention on. As we think that we have control of certain things or certain thoughts or certain ideas or certain ways that we can act in ways we should or shouldn't act, it creates a lot of stress, a lot of tension. And then we run to things like, really like opiates or painkillers or alcohol to numb that feeling of feeling incorrect or wrong, and we lash out. That's where a lot of our atrocities come from, is from this tension and stress that we feel because we feel like we're wrong, we feel like we're incorrect. So as that shifts, we'll start to notice and people start to recognize that, oh, there isn't something inherently wrong with us. We'll start to see a lot of those atrocities begin to go away because it stems from that tension. It stems from the assumption that there could possibly be a right way to live. It's not going to happen overnight because we've been existing in a mentality that thinks there is a right way to live, that there is ways to have something inherently wrong with you. When you recognize there isn't, it mitigates some of that stress and tension, allows you to see things a little bit differently, allows you to see yourself a little bit differently and act differently and focus on different things, prioritize different things, prioritizing your experience as opposed to how people are perceiving your experience, prioritizing your life as opposed to how it looks online to other people. Our priorities shift as we recognize that there isn't something inherently wrong with us. So it's very, very, very important to do so. And it can change a lot, probably a lot quicker than we think.
It's interesting that you bring up addiction. Um, the tough part about all this, and admittedly the part that we don't want to recognize, because it's what we do all the time, we just don't recognize that we're doing it, we don't want to recognize that we're doing it, is that the most addictive thing is self-absorption. Like we become self-absorbed for the sake of avoiding change, right? Rather than accept change, I will just think about how I feel about that change. And then I will complain about that feeling, try to avoid that feeling, try to cope with that feeling, try to get you to change how you're influencing that feeling. I will do everything I can about the feeling about the change to avoid the change itself. And so I'll just get totally lost in thinking about myself and thinking about my narrative, my drama, my opinions, my preferences, all of that. And that's the most important part. And the reason is simply because the alternative would be surrendering that. The alternative would be questioning that opinion or questioning that assumption or questioning that idea of myself and allowing myself to grow and change in accordance with everything around me. And so, as a way of avoiding that, I focus on my idea of myself, and I piss and I whine and I expect everybody to change for me. And I get invested in the idea of control, and I get invested in the past and the future and what I think is coming and what I deserve and what I don't deserve, and judgment and comparison and what everybody else is perceiving about me and all of that stuff, rather than just allow myself to be what I've been the entire time when I wasn't so self-absorbed and thinking about my progress, which was change embodied. Right. And what's funny about that is I know people will make the argument, it's like, well, no, judging myself is to make sure that I'm not the worst kind of person. I'm telling you right now, judging yourself is what makes you the worst kind of person. All of that pressure of trying to be a good person, all of that pressure of trying to be moral, of trying to have the right path, as Andrew was talking about, all of that pressure will eat away at you until you start cutting corners, you start making excuses, you start making justifications, and then all of a sudden you have things that you feel guilty about or regret about, and then all of a sudden you have to focus on yourself some more because of what I just said, in terms of the emotion being the problem rather than you just changing. Right? The people who are, at the end of the day, the meek that shall inherit the earth are the ones that are willing to change. It's not the ones that are out there going, I'm righteous and good and right and morally superior to everybody else, because all of that is just insecurity and assumption. Again, the only way you can know what is the empathetic thing to do at any given situation is to be in it fully without your idea of yourself in the way. And so any idea of morality beyond that, it's just to make ourselves feel better. And because ultimately we lack faith in one another. We're like, quick, tell that person what's right and wrong. They can't possibly figure it out.
Yeah, and we want control. We want to know that what we're doing is right or wrong, not because of the outcome, but so that we can feel better about ourselves. And the Krishnamurti quote, empathy has its own action, is very applicable. But with that, recognizing that just being fully, wholeheartedly paying attention to the experience that you're having, and that is the best thing that you can do to make the quote unquote right decision, which doesn't actually exist, but you can come closer to it through being super involved in the situation. There's no control in that. There's nothing to look to except yourself. There's no rule book to follow. There's no fucking 10 commandments to follow. It's just you. And that's the experience of faith, understanding that there's no one to look to in any situation that you're in. You're the best for the job. People can share bits of information, and that's the beauty of having groups and the roundtable that we got coming up. Like, people have, our experiences aren't so different, but at the end of the day, it's you making the decision, and you're the best one for the job. You have the most context, and the more you're paying attention to your experience, the more you're paying attention to the situation that you're in, the more context that you gain. But someone else doesn't have more context than you. Even if you're not paying super close attention, you're still the one involved in the situation. So the best way to gain even more context is to continue to pay attention. And if you're maintaining this idea of what's right and wrong, what's good and bad, you're going to be thinking about that and not fully paying attention to the experience that you're having. And when it comes to addiction, I like that you brought up, like, the most addictive thing we do is think about ourselves. Like, what is the number one thing that most people do throughout their day? Think about themselves. It's our primary addiction. And depending on where that idea tends to fall on average, it can cause us to want to escape that addiction. So the addictions that we experience are just replacements for the main addiction that we all focus on. And the ones that allow you to not experience so much of that addiction, thinking about yourself, like take alcohol, for example. They're detrimental, but a lot of people express that the reason that they drink is because it creates a cessation of that internal dialogue, of that constant thinking about themselves, because it comes from the underlying assumption that you're something that could possibly be thought about, like that you could even be a conceptual idea, that some of those thoughts do express you, do have some degree of relevance to the reality of what you are, which they don't. And so it's based off of that assumption that we believe any of those thoughts about ourselves to be the truth, that we believe where our value lies is based on our assumption of where our value lies, which it isn't. And so we need to replace that constant narrative, that constant addiction, that constant state of psychological suffering that we experience through trying to measure our progress, through trying to think about ourselves all the time, with other things, with something like alcohol, something that's numbing, with, you know, the harder substances that have detrimental impacts. And I'm sure there's people who will bring up things like mushrooms and weed, but the reality is that those bring you closer to the experience that you're having, they of course, and I know with weed especially, people can utilize that in a sense, and coming from a certain mentality, you can use it to a degree as an escape of the experience that you're having, but at the same time, it brings you close, like it shows you more of what you're avoiding as opposed to numbs what you're trying to escape. Like it doesn't like bog down those thoughts and that experience and the psychological suffering that you experience. And on top of that, I find it funny because a lot of those harder drugs, opiates, heroin, alcohol, I will throw into that category, cause people to act in like really fucked up ways because they're numb to the reality that they're experiencing. If you look at something like weed, which is so funny that it's still illegal, but like, what's the worst thing someone does on weed? Like, eat a little too much? Like, take a nap? Like, those are not detrimental things to society. It's so funny how we come up with this idea of just like, oh, drug, oh, it can be addictive. It's like, yeah, but take a step back and look at how people act when they're on it. They laugh a little more, usually a little more relaxed. Yeah, you can feel like it's making you paranoid or anxious, but the reality is that it's just showing you the paranoia and anxiety that you've been suppressing so that you can actually work through it. So I think just that perspective on all of those things and just drugs in general, I'm not a big fan of the word drugs because all of the substances have different impacts, different ways of utilizing them. And we've just thrown this blanket term drugs on top of all of them, which makes us assume that they all have relatively similar impacts. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And the funniest part is that we refer to it as alcohol and drugs, as if alcohol isn't arguably the worst fucking drug you can have. And I'm not sitting here saying like I don't drink. I do. I get it, and I have, and I've definitely had plenty of times where I've abused alcohol for sure. But understanding from a societal level, like what the impact is, and looking around, seeing how harmful and destructive it can be, and how much of a numbing factor it can be, and yet it's still, on every corner, anywhere you want it, you can find it, and it's very much legal despite being arguably the most harmful substance that we have on earth.
I like what we were saying there about our addiction to self-absorption becomes our addiction to the substances that help us escape that self-absorption, which unfortunately ends up becoming an addiction to a substance that ends up helping us escape the substance that was helping us escape the self-absorption. And we end up in this entire loop of trying to avoid one addiction by supplementing it with another. For example, a client of mine had a mom who was a pretty advanced alcoholic for a very long time and went to AA, or rather was forced to go to AA by her family. And in the process, basically started judging alcohol, and everybody who drank alcohol could never be in the room around alcohol, but then ended up becoming a shopaholic instead. Ended up satisfying that in another way that had a different negative consequence on her life, that created stress and pressure in a different way, was validating her in a different way. And this is kind of what I mean. And so until we get over the addiction to just endlessly thinking about ourselves, like all of a sudden we'll disappear if we don't, we just avoid that. And that's the addiction that we have to get over, because it is an addiction. It's an addiction to, how am I doing? How am I doing? How's everybody else doing? Where's this going? And you don't know, but I want to know. I have to know. If I don't know, I'm terrified. What could happen? And it's always that it's just relax, just let go, just arrive where you are. You've worked so hard to get here. You don't have to keep thinking about it, right? There's all of that goes into it, but there is this layering of addiction that happens, and this goes towards cannabis. And this is the reason I brought this up, because I will never say that cannabis can't have a negative effect on your life, quote unquote negative. And what I mean by that is that if you're addicted to self-absorption, then you're going to use any substance whatsoever to satisfy that addiction. So it doesn't matter if you're, using cannabis or using mushrooms or anything else. If you want to be avoidant, you can be. You really can. I've seen people who smoke a lot of weed who do not have a great many insights because, frankly, they don't try. They just sit down and play video games all day, or they sit down and they basically tune out in one way or another, right? It's just meant to be an escape. Likewise with mushrooms, I've known people who ate mushrooms from time to time, and it's only ever to party, right? And it's just because they don't want to go deeper, right? So there's that initial addiction that cuts the efficacy of any other experience that you're going to have. But what you'll notice, and we've had this conversation before, including with other community members, all of a sudden when you're okay, when you're not trying to escape the hell that you've been habitually creating for yourself inside your mind in terms of always judging your progress based on assumptions that are rather biased and all of that, well, then you're okay. You're not trying to escape anything, which means that any substance that you use after the fact isn't an escape. And the chance of addiction is almost not there at all. It really comes down to your escapism. That's the only reason that addiction is there, is because we're trying to escape. The reason we're addicted to self-absorption or addicted to thinking about ourselves, identity and the narrative and all of that other stuff, is because it gives us a sense of control. That's all it does. It gives us a sense of control. If I'm thinking about it, I know what's going to happen. If I'm thinking about it, I can change it. If I'm thinking about it, I can influence it. If I'm thinking about it enough. Right? And it's just a false promise. It's the promise that thought always has, that it can see everything when every thought is an individual thought. It can never think about everything. It's only when you zoom out that you can take in more and more considerations at the same time, and your intelligence can act without being so one-sided, without being so unreasonable all the time. This is the thing. This is the problem we have with the idea of focus. Everybody's like, you got to focus. It's like, that doesn't mean what you think it is, or what you think it does. It doesn't mean control. It means not being in your way. It means not adding stuff. Doesn't mean taking away stuff and bringing it down to tunnel vision. I mean, you may as well just look through a keyhole and wonder why you can't see the rest of the room, right? It's not about that. When we talk about focus, what we're talking about is allowing yourself to be where you are. So that way your intelligence can come into play and process things like it normally would if you weren't interfering with it, trying to estimate how you're doing compared to everybody else, which you can't do.
Yeah, and that the recognition of looking through, whether it's a straw or a keyhole or whatever, is kind of what we do in a lot of ways. Like when we hold on to something that allows us to create a temporary cessation of that uncertainty. Like everything beyond right now is always uncertain, all the time, no matter what. And we come up with conceptual ideas about what might happen in the future and then glom onto those, and we take it so far as to say, yeah, that's definitely what's going to happen. That just limits our ability to see things. Like it inherently limits you. Like, with something like religion, like the afterlife. Oh, I'm going to heaven as long as I do these things. Like it's such a limited perspective, because now you're looking at everything in reality through a little fucking straw hole, because that's your focus, and you're not taking everything in. You're not taking in all of the considerations. You're actually closing your eyes, closing your ears to the things that you're going through, to the experiences that you're having, because you've focused on that one little thing, because you had a fear. You were afraid because you didn't know what was to come. You still don't know what's to come. No matter how many beliefs you hold on to, no matter how much shit you grasp onto and white knuckle throughout your entire life, you still don't know what's to come, where your life's going, what's going to happen when you die. But when you take a step back and understand that you don't know that, you start looking at things with a little bit more clarity. That little fucking straw hole starts to widen, and you start to see that the way you were thinking about things was just one perspective, but it's not the perspective. Your perception of reality is not reality. And it's vital to keep that in mind, that you can't maintain an idea of what's to come and have any degree of certainty that that is what's to come. And as you shift away from that, things start to change. You start to see things differently. And it's so interesting just having this conversation, recognizing that all beliefs are just looking through a fucking keyhole, looking through a straw. And yet we, as a society, maintain this idea that you have to have a belief. You must maintain a belief. What do you believe in? What do you believe in? It's like, what straw do you look through? What little tiny wee bitty straw do you look through? It's like, I put my straw down. I actually am just looking at reality for what it is. But that's the perspective that oh, you must believe something. Oh, you don't have a belief? That's a belief. It's like, oh, you don't look through a straw? That's another straw. It's like, No, it's like Ray brought up. It's like not. It's like the idea that not playing a sport is a sport. I really, really like that one because it's obvious when you put it in that context. Not having a belief is not a belief. No differently than not playing a sport is not a fucking sport. You don't say, "What sport do you play?" I play the sport. I don't play sports. That's fucking ridiculous. I don't
It's
have.
big this year.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard my team's gonna win. Gonna win the championship. Oh god. But yeah, that it's the same thing. You don't have to maintain a belief. You don't have to glom onto a belief system. You don't. Like it's so interesting that this is even almost like a controversial topic to recognize that you don't have to believe in made up bullshit that only exists inside of your head. Because that's all it is. That's all any belief is. Belief is not this thing that's inherently tied to reality. It's inherently tied to fear and an unwillingness to recognize that everything beyond this moment is inherently uncertain. That's all that it is. It's an avoidance of what's real. It's a hope. It's a feeling of fear, and then the belief just suppresses that fear. It doesn't go away. It's still there. I know lots of people who are, especially just in my life where I grew up and everything, Christian, who are still very much afraid of death. And yet they use that in order to mitigate that fear, and yet it's still there. But if you were to put down that straw that you're looking through with that belief system, you may recognize that death isn't the thing that you think because you're not the thing that you think. And there's a whole nother world of exploration beyond the assumptions that we make about what might happen. Oh, this could happen. Oh, you can't prove that Sky Daddy doesn't exist. It's like, that's really where we're at. That's kindergarten talk. That's what 5-year-olds go back and forth with. Oh, my dad's better than yours. Oh, you can't prove that, you can't prove that Santa Claus doesn't exist either. You can't do that. And yet we've recognized that, we tell kids usually between around the age of 10 that like, yeah, no, it's not. It's just your parents doing that stuff. So it's interesting with belief just how much it's really limiting your ability to perceive certain things, not by anyone else. It's just by yourself because you're trading off the slight cessation of a certain fear and trading that with looking through a little straw as opposed to continuing to look at reality for what it is.
And I'd like to caution everyone because while all of that sounded really good, and often what I catch from people in the audience is, oh shit, I'm going to use that next time. All right, that's great. Don't get me wrong. It's nice to be able to kind of look at your delivery and go, okay, I can see where I'm hitting a wall. I'm going to see if I can, so on and so forth. Do understand that there is no perfect way to say anything where you are guaranteed to get through at all. At all. Okay. So even everything that Andrew just said, I know somebody's just like, oh, yeah, but that's a belief. Like, I guarantee it. As soon as Andrew's just like, a belief acts this way and this way and this way, it has this consequence and this consequence and this consequence. Nope, that's a belief. That's a belief. In which case I would say, watch. Honestly. And I mean that because we're not trying to sell anything. We're not trying to teach anything. Right? Like, all of this shit's free. You can watch 200 plus episodes of our podcast and not pay a goddamn dime. Okay. We're not trying to sell you anything. I mean, all we're doing is we're just telling you this is something that has obvious consequences when you're not so invested in it. That's what this is. That's why my original life coaching business was called Transcendence. That's why I created a video called Discover Transcendence, was because the only way to recognize all of this is a leap of insight. You have to stop investing in the mentality in order to look at the mentality in an unbiased way. And right now we are invested in a mentality. And that mentality blinds us to everything else. But if you're willing to question it, that's all it takes. If you're willing to just question why you think about yourself the way you do, why it seems so important, what you're trying to get out of it, what is the payoff that you've invested in, if you're willing to look at it, then all of a sudden you will be able to observe it. And in observing it, you will start to see certain things, like the fact that belief creates conflict with reality. Okay, so don't believe us by any means. Just go and check out the Dualistic Unity podcast. Start with episode 1 of season 1, because we really do kind of lay this out episode by episode by episode. It's a lot. We're talking about the foundation of everything we've invested as a mentality for thousands of years. Our entire system is based on this bullshit idea of categorization and labeling. And it's not that that's not useful, but it's ended up becoming having a life of its own. Now we're so invested in divisive concepts that we actually are acting like we're divided, which is fucking impossible. And science even knows it. Yet we don't take that in because we're so invested in this illusion of identity being truth that we actually think it's truth. And so we can't do anything about it until we're willing to question it.
Yes, please, please, goodness gracious, don't believe us at all. Don't hold on to anything that we say in any podcast episode here. Just be willing in yourself to question what you believe to be the truth. Because as much as it can seem very clear when you start to recognize, oh, that's not what I think. Oh, that's not what I think. Oh, I'm not what I think. Oh, society is all made up and all of that stuff. It starts to get a lot clearer. Everything just is. Everything just is what is, and we've made so many assumptions about that. But the reality is that we've made so many assumptions about that. There's so many layers to this conversation. So as simple as it may seem in moments of clarity, like, oh, I'm not what I think. Everything that I'm concerned about in my head is just my own assumption. And when people judge me and think about me, they're really just trying to fix and make up for an insecurity that they have inside of themselves. Like in moments of clarity, it can seem very obvious, but there's a lot built upon that because there's a process of building an idea of yourself. The stages of ego development by Jane Lovinger, for anyone who hasn't checked all of that out, or also Discover Transcendence, a video that Ray made about 5 years ago that touches very clearly and in depthly in a pretty concise way all the things that we're talking about. It's like 48 minutes long. It's on YouTube. You can check it out. Like all of those things. There it is. Yeah, just you can just screenshot that, get the code there, find it on YouTube. And all of those things talk about the process of building an idea of ourselves and building sort of our ego and our perception of ourself. But the reason that we do that as we're growing up is to be able to utilize it as a tool, because that's all it is. Your idea of yourself, your identity, your ego is just a tool, but it's not what you are. The idea inside of your head that you maintain is not what you are. Your idea of where your value lies is not where your value lies. Your assumption about another person that you're judging is not what they are either. We're always maintaining these assumptions about where we fit relative to someone else. And yet it's all psychological, it's all conceptual, it's all based upon ideas that don't exist in reality. And so as we build that idea of ourself, there's what, like 9 or 10 stages of ego development essentially, and we're like humanity, like adult humans are on stage 3 or 4. There's 6 or 7 more stages beyond that, and we've settled upon that, which is rooted around believing that your conceptual idea of yourself is actually what you are and where your value lies. And all of your assumptions are truth. Your idea of what might happen in the future is what's going to happen. You know, your belief in Sky Daddy, that you have to use your mind to maintain, you need to think in order to believe in something outside of what is here and now. You need to utilize your mind, and therefore you have to take certain thoughts to be the truth in order to believe in Sky Daddy or whatever, you know, belief system you hold on to. And what's that going to do? It's going to reinforce that all of the other ideas of yourself might be the truth when none of them are. None of your thoughts about things are the thing. Just like how your idea of air is not the air that you breathe. Your idea of water is not the water that you drink. The description is not the described ever. And it's a fundamental understanding that is so vital to our experience that we don't recognize. Like, we think our idea of air is the air that we breathe. We think our idea of ourself is us, but it's not. It's just a conceptual idea. And so that is one of the many things we discuss. That's kind of an underlying recognition that we talk about very often on the podcast. But within that recognition, there's so much more because there's so much less weight that you have to carry as you go through your life. It's not to say that you don't get caught up in it, because as you utilize it as a tool, it's got a certain gravity to it almost. Like you can feel the pull. And as soon as a concern about what you think you are comes up, it can kind of take it with you. So it's important to keep in mind that, oh yeah, that's not me. That's not me either. You're having the experience of it, and it's important to have an identity, an ego, all of that stuff. It allows us to have this experience where we perceive a division despite it not actually being the reality. And we've just gotten so far with this that we believe that it is the reality, but it's never been the reality. Our conceptual idea, our conceptual world that we maintain inside of our head is just assumption. And when it comes to the idea of you that you maintain inside of your mind is different than everyone else's idea of you. Entirely different. No one has the same idea of you that you have. And so your value couldn't possibly be actually what your idea of your value is maintained in. But we'll take that, we'll take that perception of ourself over the reality of the uncertainty about what we think we are, about what we think other people think about us. We'll take that false certainty, even if it's a negative idea of ourselves, over the recognition that we don't know and we can't possibly ever know, because you're just it. So you just keep stepping through change when you recognize that through uncertainty. But at first, it can be a little bit jarring because we've invested for a very long time in that conceptual idea of ourselves.
And for anybody who happens to be watching this, thinking to yourself, the description isn't the described. That sounds very esoteric. That sounds, like one of those spiritual philosophical things. I would encourage you to go and check out Chat GPT and just ask it if the description is the described. Ask it, in fact, if it's important to understand that the description is not the described, and listen or read what its answer is, because it will tell you that it's fundamental to understanding anything about life. This simple insight is fundamental to the point where ChatGPT knows it. But how often are we actually talked about or talked to about this when we're going through school? How often do they give us a description that we got to memorize and pass the test on, and then afterwards and go, yeah, but that's not really the whole picture? Never. They never, ever do that, right? Unless it's to get us to another concept, which is another test, which is another endpoint, right? The description is never the described. You are not what you think you are. Things are not what you think they are. People are not what you think they are. Nothing is what you think it is. It's just that if you didn't immediately settle on some kind of an assumption, you'd be locked in paralysis. Your brain has to settle on, that's the best I can do right now. And we make the mistake of going, that's all there is to it. That's the only habit. And we only do that because we're afraid. We're afraid that if we don't go, that's all there is to it, there might be more. And there is. And who cares? Because we have all the ability in the world to process that more. If we just have some faith in ourselves and stop relying on some idea of what we can or cannot do. Just witness it. Watch it unfold, and you will be amazed at what you can do. It's not bound by this narrative that you have in your head unless you are bound to that narrative yourself. That all said, we are coming to the end of this. We're going to take a short break, and we are going to continue on with our roundtable episode at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, this episode involves community members, though admittedly, we only have 3 community members who have signed up for the roundtable today. So it's going to be a smaller one, unless anybody signs up in the next 5 minutes. Of course, if you would like to do that, you can do so by joining us on Patreon. We have a 7-day free trial. The roundtable is open to Tier 2 and Tier 3 supporters. So you can jump on, be part of the episode, even help mold the conversation, toss in some victory stories, toss in some insights, some questions, whatever it is you'd like to do. We would love to see you because, frankly, this is where the best part of dualistic unity is, in the community. So we're going to wrap up here, and we'll see you very shortly, everyone.
Looking forward to it. Bye, everyone.